You keep calling it sensitivity, as though sensitivity alone explains why the same kind of wound keeps finding you. The same emotionally unavailable person, the same friendship in which you become the listener and disappear. The same workplace where your competence is rewarded with more pressure and less care. The same family role in which everyone is allowed to fall apart except you. You tell yourself that you attract these situations because you feel more deeply, love more honestly, or notice what others miss. But that explanation protects you from a more difficult possibility. The lesson repeats because some part of you is still cooperating with the pattern. Carl Jung spent decades studying exactly this kind of repetition. He saw that the psyche does not merely remember what wounded you, it organizes perception around it. It pulls your attention toward familiar emotional structures, gives them a strange sense of significance, and then asks you to meet the same conflict again in a different form. Not because you deserve punishment, not because the universe has selected you for suffering, because what remains unconscious does not disappear. It returns as atmosphere, attraction, instinct, hesitation, and choice. The hidden reason-sensitive souls repeat the same lesson is not that they are too pure for the world. It is that sensitivity often develops beside self-abandonment. You become highly skilled at detecting the emotional states of others while remaining uncertain about your own limits. You can feel a shift in someone's tone before they admit anything is wrong, but you may not recognize the moment your own body says no. You can understand why someone behaves badly, yet struggle to decide that understanding does not obligate you to stay. Your sensitivity becomes outward-facing. It reads the room with precision, then excludes you from the reading. This is why the pattern feels mysterious. You are not consciously choosing pain. You are choosing what feels meaningful, familiar, redeemable, or emotionally charged. The wound is hidden inside the meaning. Jung called these organizing forces complexes. A complex is not simply a bad memory. It is a cluster of emotion, expectation, bodily reaction, fantasy, and belief that behaves almost like a separate personality inside you. When a complex is activated, you do not merely remember the past. You begin to interpret the present through it. A delayed reply becomes abandonment. A troubled person becomes a mission. A controlling person becomes someone who only needs patience. A request that should be refused becomes a test of whether you are good. The complex does not announce itself. It speaks in your own voice. It tells you to give one more chance. It tells you that leaving would be cruel. It tells you that your discomfort is probably an overreaction. It tells you that the connection is unusually deep because it is unusually intense. It tells you that this time you will finally be understood if you explain yourself clearly enough. What you experience as intuition may sometimes be the complex recognizing the architecture of an old wound. That distinction matters. Sensitivity is real, but sensitivity does not make every emotional pull wise. You can perceive another person accurately and still misunderstand what their presence means for your life. You can sense their loneliness and mistakenly believe you were meant to heal it. You can see their potential and ignore their pattern. You can feel compassion and call it compatibility. A sensitive person once sat at the edge of a bed with a phone glowing in one hand. A message had arrived after 3 days of silence. Sorry, things have been hard. The body tightened before the mind began producing reasons. Within minutes, the reply had been softened, rewritten, and stripped of every honest sentence. The door to the room was closed quietly, not to create privacy, but to avoid being asked why this had happened again. That is how repetition often works. The lesson does not return wearing the face of the past. It returns through the same inner movement. You notice harm, explain it. Minimize your response and remain available. The external person changes. Your psychological role does not. If the pattern stays unconscious, the cost is larger than another painful relationship. You begin to build an identity around endurance. You become proud of how much you can understand, absorb, forgive, and carry. You call this depth. Others call it reliability. But beneath it, your life is increasingly arranged around managing what other people refuse to face in themselves. Sensitivity becomes dangerous when it hardens into a persona. Jung used the word persona for the social face you develop in order to belong. It is not false in the ordinary sense. It contains real qualities. You may genuinely be patient, insightful, gentle, and emotionally perceptive. The problem begins when these qualities become compulsory. You are no longer kind because kindness is true in the moment. You are kind because you do not know who you are allowed to be without it. The sensitive persona often forms early. You learn that harmony keeps you safe. You learn that being easy to handle protects connection. You learn to detect irritation before it becomes rejection. Over time, your goodness becomes less like a value and more like a survival position. You are admired for the very trait that prevents you from becoming whole. A man stood in a kitchen while a friend spoke sharply to him for the third time that week. His hand remained on the cupboard handle long after he had found the glass he needed. He noticed the exhaustion in the friend's face, the tremor in the voice, the pressure behind the anger. He noticed everything except the fact that he had been insulted. Later, he described the friend as overwhelmed and himself as probably too sensitive. What you are calling compassion may be the old persona preventing you from registering injury. Once sensitivity becomes identity, every boundary threatens more than the relationship. It threatens your self-image. If you say no, you fear becoming cold. If you stop explaining, you fear becoming unfair. If you allow someone to misunderstand you, you fear losing the moral innocence on which your identity depends. The repeated lesson continues because each new situation gives you another chance to protect the persona instead of protecting the person beneath it. What you refuse to embody in yourself will often confront you through someone else. Jung called this the shadow. The shadow contains more than shameful impulses. It contains every quality your conscious identity has rejected. For a sensitive person, the shadow often holds anger, self-interest, authority, suspicion, bluntness, ambition, and the capacity to withdraw care. These traits are not automatically cruel. They become frightening because they conflict with the image you learn to maintain. When healthy aggression is pushed into the shadow, you do not stop encountering aggression. You simply meet it outside yourself. You become fascinated by decisive people, intimidated by demanding people, and entangled with people who take up the space you refuse to claim. Their selfishness seems enormous because your own self-interest has been exiled. Their certainty seems overpowering because your own authority has not been practiced. A woman listened while a colleague assigned her another task without asking. She smiled, opened her notebook, and wrote it down. Her jaw hurt before the meeting ended. On the train home, she replayed the colleague's arrogance in exact detail, imagining sentences she would never say aloud. The next morning, she arrived early to make sure the task was completed perfectly. The resentment you feel may be your shadow, showing you the boundary your conscious personality refuses to draw. This is one of the most painful truths in Jungian psychology. The person who disturbs you may be carrying a distorted version of your own unlived power. This does not excuse their behavior. It reveals why their behavior enters so deeply. They are not merely crossing a line, they are acting out a capacity you have forbidden in yourself. Until you reclaim that capacity in a conscious form, the psyche keeps placing you near unconscious versions of it. You meet control until you develop authority. You meet indifference until you develop discernment. You meet people who take without shame until you learn that receiving, refusing, and choosing are not moral failures. Familiarity can feel like destiny when a complex is activated. Jung observed that complexes alter the field of consciousness. They capture attention, distort proportion, and produce reactions that feel larger than the immediate moment. This is why some people feel strangely important almost at once. Something in their manner, distance, need, unpredictability, or emotional rhythm activates an old structure. The nervous system recognizes the pattern before the conscious mind understands it. Recognition is not the same as safety. You may call the feeling chemistry. You may call it spiritual recognition. You may believe you have met someone who sees the hidden parts of you. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes the intensity comes from a simpler source. You have entered a familiar emotional climate. The uncertainty is known. The effort is known. The waiting is known. The hope of finally changing the ending is known. A sensitive person met someone who asked unusually personal questions during the first conversation. The attention felt rare and penetrating. When the questions stopped a week later, the sensitive person began offering more, speaking longer, revealing details that had not been earned. Each silence produced another confession. The connection felt profound because the old anxiety had found a new voice. What you are calling a deep bond may be the body recognizing the labor it has performed before. This explains why steady people can initially feel underwhelming. They do not activate the complex with the same force. There is no urgent puzzle to solve, no emotional distance to cross, no hidden wound asking for your special understanding. Their consistency may feel flat because your inner world has learned to associate longing with love and uncertainty with significance. The repeated lesson is therefore not only about whom you meet, it is about what your psyche experiences as alive. If calm feels empty, you will be drawn toward disruption. If clarity feels exposed, you will prefer ambiguity. If mutuality feels unfamiliar, you may mistrust it. The complex does not seek happiness. It seeks completion on the terms it already knows. Empathy can become a hidden bargain with rejection. This is difficult to admit because empathy appears generous. Yet Jungian work asks you to examine not only what a trait looks like, but what function it serves. You may understand others because understanding is natural to you. You may also understand them because it gives you a role. If you can identify the wound behind their behavior, you can remain necessary. If you remain necessary, perhaps you will not be left. The bargain is rarely conscious. It sounds like patience. It feels like devotion. Beneath it is an attempt to create security through emotional usefulness. You become the one who can handle complexity, forgive contradiction, and see the frightened child beneath the difficult adult. You hope that being uniquely understanding will earn uniquely reliable love. A person sat in a parked car outside an apartment building, rehearsing how to raise a painful issue without causing discomfort. The words were made smaller each time. By the time the conversation happened, the request had become reassurance for the other person. Afterward, the person returned to the car and stared at the steering wheel, confused by the familiar emptiness. What you are calling patience may be an effort to purchase permanence with your own disappearance. The problem is not empathy. The problem is empathy without discrimination. Jung insisted that psychological development requires differentiation, the ability to separate one thing from another. Their pain is not your duty. Their history is not your instruction. Their potential is not their character. Your understanding of why they hurt you does not make the hurt less relevant. Without differentiation, sensitivity turns every boundary into a moral crisis. You feel the other person's disappointment and experience it as evidence that you have done something wrong. You sense their shame and rush to relieve it before they can take responsibility. You detect their loneliness and abandon your own clarity to prevent it. The lesson repeats because empathy keeps dissolving the very distinctions that would end the pattern. Your unexpressed anger does not disappear. It changes form. Jung treated emotion as psychologically meaningful energy. When anger is denied conscious expression, it does not become virtue. It moves underground. It becomes fatigue, indecision, fantasy, sudden withdrawal, bodily tension, quiet contempt, or attraction to people who express anger without restraint. The psyche does not eliminate what you refuse. It compensates. Sensitive people often fear anger because they have seen it used destructively. You may associate anger with humiliation, chaos, domination, or loss of control, so you attempt to become the opposite. You speak carefully. You wait until you are certain. You collect context. You search for the fairest interpretation. By the time you permit yourself to be angry, the moment for a clean response has passed. A woman heard a familiar joke at her expense during dinner. She smiled before anyone could look at her closely. Under the table, one foot pressed hard against the floor. She washed the dishes after everyone left, moving each plate with exaggerated care. 2 days later, she canceled plans without explaining why, and felt guilty for being distant. What you are calling emotional maturity may be anger that has been denied a direct and honorable form. Healthy anger is not the desire to injure. It is the psyche's capacity to register violation and mobilize separation. It says this is too much. It says this does not belong to me. It says access has conditions. When that function remains unconscious, your boundaries arrive late, after resentment has already contaminated the relationship. This is why the same lesson can repeat even after you become more self-aware. You may understand your childhood. You may recognize the pattern. You may name the attachment wound. But if your anger remains shadowed, insight alone will not protect you. You will see the boundary and still fail to embody it. The lesson repeats because you keep occupying the same role. Jung understood that archetypal patterns can possess the personality. When this happens, you do not merely behave in a certain way. You enter a role that seems larger than choice. The rescuer finds the wounded. The peacemaker finds conflict. The abandoned one finds distance. The invisible one finds people who do not look closely. Each role carries an emotional script, and every script requires other characters. This does not mean you consciously create another person's behavior. It means your role influences what you tolerate, reward, explain, pursue, and remain near. You may leave one controlling relationship and enter another because the controlling person was never the whole pattern. Your role was to doubt your own perception, negotiate for basic respect, and confuse endurance with loyalty. Until that role changes, the cast can change, while the story remains intact. A sensitive person began a new friendship with someone who seemed more open than the last. The details were different. The conversations were warmer. Yet within months, plans were always arranged around the other person's needs. When disappointment appeared, the sensitive person said, "It is not a big deal," with the same tone used years earlier in a completely different room. What you are calling bad luck may be an old role, preserving itself through new circumstances. The role survives because it offers something. It may offer identity. It may offer superiority. It may allow you to be the reasonable one, the deep one, the loyal one, the one who tried everything. It may protect you from the risk of asking whether you genuinely want the relationship, because focusing on whether they will choose you is more familiar than deciding whether you choose them. That reversal is central to individuation. Jung used individuation to describe the lifelong movement towards psychological wholeness, not perfection. Wholeness requires that you stop organizing your life entirely around the approval, need, fear, or misunderstanding of others. It asks you to become a subject in your own life, rather than a sensitive instrument in everyone else's. The same lesson ends only when your role becomes impossible to perform, not when you identify the pattern, not when you explain it beautifully, not when you forgive the past. It ends when the old role can no longer recruit your behavior, when silence no longer makes you chase, when distress no longer makes you volunteer, when another person's disappointment no longer overrules your decision, when potential no longer outranks evidence. Your insight is not complete until it changes what receives access to you. There is another layer beneath all of this, and it is the one you may resist most. The repeated lesson may continue, because part of you prefers familiar suffering to unfamiliar responsibility. Familiar suffering allows you to remain who you already know how to be. You know how to wait. You know how to analyze. You know how to hope. You know how to survive an unequal bond while extracting meaning from it. Responsibility asks something more frightening. It asks you to act before certainty. It asks you to disappoint someone without proving they are a villain. It asks you to leave situations that are painful, but not dramatic enough to justify leaving in the eyes of everyone else. This is the shadow beneath the shadow. You may not only fear being hurt, you may fear becoming the person who can no longer be controlled by the possibility of being misunderstood. To end the lesson, you may have to surrender the identity of the endlessly understanding person. You may have to let someone call you selfish. You may have to watch disappointment cross a face and refuse to repair it. You may have to accept that a boundary can be right even when it causes pain. You may have to grieve relationships that depended on your lack of limits. The cost is real. Some people will not celebrate your individuation. They benefited from your confusion. They experienced your self-abandonment as generosity, your fear as flexibility, your silence as peace. When you become clear, they may say you have changed. They will be correct. The version of you they could access without consequence is disappearing. You may also lose the private moral advantage of being the one who never caused harm. Mature choice makes innocence impossible. Every real decision excludes another possibility. Every boundary frustrates someone. Every honest no interrupts a fantasy. If you insist on remaining harmless in everyone's story, you will remain absent from your own. Jung did not describe individuation as a comfortable improvement of the personality. He described a confrontation with unconscious opposites. Your gentleness must meet firmness. Your empathy must meet judgment. Your openness must meet privacy. Your care for others must meet loyalty to yourself. Until these opposites are held together, the rejected half will continue to arrive from outside. This is why the final repetition can feel especially painful. You know more, yet the pattern appears again. You may interpret this as failure, but the return of the pattern often reveals the exact point where understanding has not become embodiment. The lesson is no longer hidden in the other person. It is visible in the moment you betray what you already know. You feel the contraction and continue. You hear the excuse and translate it into hope. You recognize the imbalance and offer more. You wait for external proof strong enough to free you from the responsibility of choosing. No one can make that choice painless for you. No theory can remove the grief. No spiritual language can guarantee that the person you leave will understand. The threshold is psychological because it requires you to tolerate the emotions your old pattern was designed to avoid: guilt, uncertainty, loneliness, and the loss of being seen as good. The repeated lesson asks a specific question. Are you willing to become temporarily uncomfortable in order to stop being permanently divided? You are allowed to stop interpreting every person who hurts you. You are allowed to understand less and observe more. You are allowed to let behavior mean what it repeatedly does. You are allowed to notice that someone is wounded without turning their wound into your assignment. You are allowed to leave questions unanswered when the answer has already been demonstrated through pattern. You are allowed to stop proving that your sensitivity is benevolent. Your sensitivity does not need to be justified through endless availability. It does not become cruel when it includes your own body, time, and limits. A sensitivity that perceives everyone except you is not complete sensitivity. It is vigilance wearing a beautiful name. You are allowed to stop fighting your anger as though it threatens your goodness. Anger can become language instead of explosion. It can become distance instead of revenge. It can become one clear sentence, spoken before resentment needs a speech. The shadow does not ask you to become harsh. It asks you to reclaim the force that keeps your tenderness from being used against you. You are allowed to let a lesson end without receiving an apology. Closure may not arrive as recognition from the person who repeated the wound. It may arrive as your refusal to repeat your response. The psyche does not require everyone to understand your transformation. It requires you to stop abandoning it. The same lesson was never proof that you were cursed with too much feeling. It was evidence that your feeling had not yet become discrimination, authority, and choice. What kept returning was not punishment. It was the unlived part of you asking to enter the room. So the next time the pattern appears, the question is not why this keeps happening to you. The question is who you become when it happens. The lesson ends when your sensitivity no longer serves your disappearance and begins serving your wholeness. If this resonates, subscribe to The Waking Shadow, where you explore Jung's psychology for the path of individuation. Watch the video on your screen now for the next pattern your unconscious may be asking you to see.